The gown felt heavier than it should have in my arms, the weight of 8 months' work pressing against my chest as I walked down the carpeted hallway toward the bridal suite. I'd imagined this moment so many times, Morel's face lighting up the room, falling into that reverent hush when something truly beautiful enters. The door stood slightly ajar, laughter spilling through the crack. I slowed, adjusting my grip on the garment bag. "If Mom asks, say it doesn't fit." Morel's voice floated out clear and sharp as a pin. "It looks like something from a thrift store." Another burst of giggles followed, the kind that doesn't invite anyone in. I stood there, the words sinking in like cold water down my spine. My thumb found the zipper pull pressing against it until my knuckle turned white. I pushed the door open. The chatter died instantly. Morel glanced at me, her smile faltering before she rearranged it into something practiced. "Mom? Oh, did you hear that? We were just joking," she said lightly, as if that could lift the sting from her words. I stepped inside, keeping my shoulders straight, my face unreadable. The room smelled faintly of hairspray and perfume, curling irons lined up on the vanity like soldiers. I unzipped the bag, revealing the gown's ivory silk, the hand-sewn lace shimmering under the soft lighting. No one moved closer. Morel took it from me with a careful grip, almost like she was holding a damp towel she didn't want to drip on the floor. Without comment, she crossed the room and hung it on a rack in the corner, away from the other dresses. "Thanks, Mom," she said, not looking at me. I stood there for another heartbeat, the hum of the air conditioning filling the space where something warmer should have been. Then I turned toward the door, my fingers brushing the empty fabric bag. The hallway outside was quiet, my footsteps muted on the carpet. Back in my car, the garment bag lay on the passenger seat, limp and light now, as if the weight it once held had shifted entirely onto me. Back home, I laid the empty garment bag across my sewing table, smoothing the creases with my palm. The fabric smelled faintly of starch from the countless times I'd pressed that gown, each pleat coaxed into place by my own hands. 8 months ago, I'd decided Morel's wedding would be my last big project. I sold the gold watch her father had left me, his retirement gift from the factory, to pay for imported Italian silk and lace. I'd been saving in my mind for years. Every bead, every stitch, every seam had been done under the glow of my work lamp, the hours stretching long into the night while the rest of the street slept. I remembered measuring her in my kitchen, her arms lifted obediently as I wrapped the tape around her waist, the same way I used to measure her for school dresses. She had smiled then, not the strained smile from today, but a genuine one. I'd taken it as a promise, unspoken but certain that she understood what I was giving her. There had been calls from old clients asking if I could take on a gown or two, but I'd declined each time. "This one's for my daughter," I told them, pride softening my voice. I thought I was making an heirloom, something she'd one day pass down perhaps, with a story of her mother's devotion stitched into its seams. I ran my fingertips over the measuring tape, now coiled on the table, the metal tip cool against my skin. The room was quiet, except for the faint tick of the wall clock, each second pulling me further from the moment I'd walked into that bridal suite. On the far shelf, a row of neatly labeled boxes held remnants from other dresses. I'd made scraps of satin, bits of lace ribbons still curled from the spool. They'd all been claimed with joy, each one a piece of someone's happiest day. This gown, though, this one had no place to belong. I turned off the light in the sewing room and walked toward the kitchen, the thought already forming, before I realized I'd decided anything at all. 2 nights later, Morel invited me to dinner at her townhouse. It was one of those polite invitations that felt more like an obligation, but I went anyway. Carrying a bottle of wine I knew she wouldn't drink. The table was already set when I arrived. White plates, polished silver candles flickering in glass holders. Varel's mother was there, sitting at the head of the table, as though she'd always been part of the family. Morel was in the kitchen, arranging salad on a platter. "Mom, sit here," she said, pulling out a chair at the far end away from the candles in the center conversation. I slid into it without a word, the cushion firm under me. Dinner began with small talk wedding venues, guest lists, the caterer's tasting menu. I listened, my fork moving in slow, deliberate motions. Halfway through the meal, Morel leaned toward Varel's mother and said, "Don't worry, you'll have final say over the reception budget. I've already told Mom she doesn't need to contribute anything else." I kept my eyes on my plate, the vinaigrette tang sharp on my tongue. Varel nodded. "It's better this way." Less confusion. The conversation moved on, but their words sat heavy in my chest. I wasn't just being pushed to the edge of the table, I was being quietly erased from the process entirely. The gown, my one real contribution, was already hanging in a corner, somewhere ignored. Now, even my presence in the planning was being trimmed away, as if I were an extra thread they could snip without changing the shape of the garment. When the plates were cleared, I thanked them for dinner and stood, my hands resting briefly on the back of my chair. Morel walked me to the door, kissed my cheek quickly, and told me she'd call next week. The night air was cool as I stepped outside. I walked slowly to my car, the bottle of untouched wine still in my tote, and unlocked the door. Sliding into the driver's seat, I started the engine, a different plan beginning to take shape in my mind. The next afternoon, I found myself parked in front of the little used bookstore downtown. I'd been there a few times before, usually to browse the craft section or sell a stack of old paperbacks. That was where I'd first met Isolde, bright-eyed, soft-spoken, and quick to notice details most people missed. I stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming. The scent of old paper and binding glue settled around me. Isolde was behind the counter, stacking a pile of hardcover novels. She looked up, her face lighting with recognition. "Mrs. Droslin," she greeted warmly. "Back for more sewing books." "Just looking today," I said, drifting toward the counter. "How's the wedding planning going?" Her smile faltered. "On hold, actually. We had to push the date back again. Venue costs, you know. And the dress is the last thing on my mind right now." I nodded, letting the silence breathe between us. "You deserve a dress you feel proud to walk in," I said finally. She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "At this rate, I might walk down the aisle in a sundress." I bought a small novel I didn't need just to keep the conversation going a little longer. As she wrapped it in brown paper, I studied her face, hopeful, but worn thin around the edges. When I stepped back out into the sunlight, I paused on the sidewalk. The image of her standing in that corner of the store, speaking so lightly about giving up her dream gown, clung to me. I thought about the silk and lace hanging uselessly in Morel's room. By the time I reached my car, the idea had rooted itself firmly. That dress deserved to be worn. And more than that, it deserved to be cherished. I would go back to the room where Morel had hung it and take it back with my own hands. I started the engine, the hum steady beneath my palms, already knowing exactly where I'd be going later that week. 3 nights later, I waited until the street outside was still, and the porch lights across the road had gone dark. The dress hung in front of me, its silk catching the dim glow of the sewing room lamp. I unhooked it from the rack, folding the skirt carefully over my arm so the beading wouldn't snag. I laid it inside a plain white garment bag, no labels, no hints of where it had come from. The zipper's soft rasp sounded louder than it should have in the quiet. Slipping on my coat, I carried it to the car. The weight balanced over my arm like a fragile promise. The drive to Isolde's house took less than 15 minutes. The streets were lined with bare trees, their shadows stretching across the pavement in thin, crooked lines. Her small duplex came into view, a single warm light glowing in the front window. When I knocked, she opened the door in a sweater and socks, surprise flickering in her eyes. Mrs. Droslin, is everything okay? I held out the garment bag. It's for you, I said simply. If you'll wear it with joy, it's yours. Her hands hesitated before taking it, as if she was afraid it might vanish. I can't. I couldn't possibly. You can, I interrupted gently. No conditions. Just promise me you'll let it be part of your day. Her eyes shimmered as she unzipped the bag just enough to see the ivory silk. A sound escaped her. Half gasp, half laugh, and she stepped forward to hug me, the kind of embrace that says more than words. I didn't linger. I stepped back, nodded once, and turned toward the car. The night air was cold against my face, but my chest felt strangely light. Back in the driver's seat, I started the engine and glanced once at her front window. She stood there holding the gown, the lamplight wrapping around her like a blessing. I pulled away from the curb, the road ahead, open and dark, already wondering how the dress might look when sunlight finally touched it. 2 weeks passed without a word from Morel, but one morning, while I sipped my coffee at the kitchen table, a headline on my phone caught my eye. It was a feature from a popular local wedding blog, Love in Simplicity. A bookstore bride's big day. I clicked. The first photo filled the screen, and my breath caught. There was Isolde standing under a canopy of wildflowers, sunlight streaming through the silk I had stitched, every seam smooth, every bead catching light like water. The lace sleeves framed her shoulders perfectly, the skirt flowing with the kind of grace only fabric made for the wearer could have. The article told the story of her modest ceremony, how she and her fiancé had exchanged vows in the courtyard behind the bookstore, surrounded by friends, family, and stacks of old books. The gown was mentioned in almost every paragraph, a one-of-a-kind creation, crafted by a local seamstress, gifted to the bride in an act of quiet generosity. Scrolling through, I saw dozens of photos. Isolde laughing, dancing her skirt, fanning out in soft waves. Each image was like proof that the dress had found its rightful place, worn by someone who moved as though she was born to wear it. At the end of the article was a link more from the photographer here. I clicked, and suddenly there were hundreds of likes, comments pouring in from people asking who had made the dress, if they could commission one, where they could find the person behind the work. I set the phone down slowly, my fingers curling around my coffee cup. The warmth seeped into my hands, steadying me. I didn't need to answer any of those comments. Word had a way of traveling when the work spoke for itself. By the time I rinsed my cup and set it in the sink, my mind was already cataloging fabrics, sketching silhouettes, pulling me toward the sewing room. The first call came 2 days later. A woman named Maribeth introduced herself, explaining she'd seen the photos of Isolde's wedding online and had fallen in love with the gown. She wanted something similar. Same elegance, same hand-finished details, but in soft blush instead of ivory. I hesitated only a moment before saying yes. By the end of the week, there were 4 more calls. Some were brides, others were mothers or sisters, each with their own story and vision. They all had one thing in common: they didn't want something mass-produced. They wanted what that gown in the photographs had soul-stitched into every seam. I cleared the long work table in my sewing room, laying out bolts of silk rolls of lace, jars of beads. The room hummed with quiet purpose again, my days flowing in the steady rhythm of measuring, cutting, and sewing. I worked late into the night, sometimes with the radio low in the background, other times in complete silence. The orders paid well better than any commission I'd taken in years, but it wasn't just about the money. Each finished dress left me with a deep, quiet satisfaction, knowing it would be cherished rather than hidden away. One afternoon, as I packed a gown into its box, I noticed the return address on the shipping label, the same wedding photographer who'd shot Isolde's ceremony. A note inside the order form read, "Your work is extraordinary. I'd love to collaborate." I tucked the note into my desk drawer, a small smile tugging at my lips. Opportunities like this didn't just appear, they arrived when you'd unknowingly been preparing for them all along. By the end of the month, my sewing schedule was booked solid for the next 3. The sewing machine's steady whir had become the heartbeat of the house, a sound that felt both familiar and new. Late one evening, as I pressed the final seam on a champagne-colored gown, my phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with Morel's name, the first time in weeks I'd seen it there. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, the soft hum of the sewing machine filling the space between rings. Then I pressed accept and lifted the phone to my ear. Mom Morel's voice came overly bright, like she'd practiced it in front of a mirror. "It's been a while. I've been meaning to call." I let the silence stretch, letting her fill it. "So, I saw this wedding blog today," she continued. "That dress, Isolde's dress, it was yours, wasn't it?" I said nothing. Her tone shifted, a thread of irritation slipping through. "You gave it away. The dress you made for me. I gave it to someone who wanted it," I said evenly, pressing the seam beneath my iron. "Someone who would wear it." There was a pause, then a sharp exhale. "You could have told me. People are talking about it. Apparently everyone wants one now. You're taking orders." "I am." She hesitated again, then laughed, but it was brittle. "Well, maybe you could make mine now. You know something even better, since you're clearly in demand." I set the iron down, watching the steam curl upward. "I don't take every order," I replied. Another pause. I could almost hear her trying to decide whether to push or pivot. "Right. Well, I guess I'll let you get back to work." The line clicked dead before I could answer. I placed the phone face down on the counter and turned back to the gown in front of me, the silk smooth beneath my fingers. Outside, the night had deepened the streetlights, casting long, quiet shadows across the yard. I worked until my shoulders ached, finishing the last of the beadwork before draping the dress carefully on the mannequin. When I finally stepped away, the sewing room felt fuller somehow, as if the air itself carried the hum of what was coming next. A week later, I got an email from the editor of that same wedding blog. She wanted to feature me, my work, my process. The story behind the gown that had quietly gone viral. At first, I almost deleted it. But then I thought of the women who had already called me, who had trusted me to create something personal. Maybe it was time to step forward. We met at my sewing room. She was young, eager, armed with a camera and a notepad. She asked about my training, my inspirations, the fabrics I loved most. I showed her the neat rows of thread spools, the pattern sketches pinned to my wall, the boxes of beads organized by size and sheen. When she asked about the gown in the photographs, I told her the truth, almost all of it. I explained that it had been made for someone else who didn't want it, and that I'd chosen to give it to someone who would cherish it. I didn't name names. The dress had found its way, and that was enough. She asked if I realized how much attention the photos had brought me. I told her I did, but that it wasn't about the numbers or the orders, it was about making something that mattered. By the end of the interview, she had taken a dozen photos of me at my work table, one hand on the fabric, the other holding a needle mid-stitch. When she left, she promised the article would be live by the weekend. True to her word, it went up 2 days later. The response was immediate emails, calls, even handwritten letters arriving at my door. Some were from brides-to-be, others from women who simply wanted to own something handmade, something built to last. Business wasn't just steady now, it was flourishing. I adjusted my schedule, set clear boundaries, and still found myself working longer hours. But the work felt lighter, somehow. Late Friday night, as I finished hemming a dress in pale gold, I heard a knock at my front door. I set the dress aside carefully and went to the door. Morel stood on the porch, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, eyes darting past me into the house. She looked smaller somehow, though her voice still carried its usual edge when she spoke. I've been thinking, she began, about the dress, about everything. I waited. Her gaze dropped to the wooden floorboards between us. I shouldn't have said what I did. It was cruel. I didn't realize what it meant to you. I see it now, what your work means to other people. The words hung there, thin and awkward. She looked up again, softer this time. I don't expect you to make me another gown. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I studied her face, searching for the little girl who used to sit beside me while I sewed, running her fingers through scraps of fabric, dreaming out loud about someday wearing one of my dresses. I couldn't find her entirely, but there was a flicker. Small, but real. I hope you find something you love, I said quietly, and that you wear it like it belongs to you. She nodded, swallowing whatever else she'd planned to say, and stepped back. I'll let you get back to work. I watched her walk down the path to her car, the taillights disappearing into the night. Closing the door, I leaned against it for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me again. Back in the sewing room, the pale gold gown waited under the soft glow of the lamp. I picked up my needle and returned to the hem, the fabric cool and smooth beneath my hands. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of chimes from somewhere down the street. Inside, my stitches fell into their steady rhythm, each one binding me to the life I had rebuilt thread by thread.